Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Okay, here we are. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting this date. Some of you put this date in your calendars a year and a half ago. Some of you put this date in your calendars a year ago. And even those who put this date in your calendar 6 months ago said to me, what the fuck? Do you people really plan that far in advance? The answer is we do. A couple of thank yous. First, Jessica Lowenthal, where are you? She always disappears. Where's Jessica? Jessica, please come in. This is Jessica Lowenthal, director of the Kelly Writers House, who really organized this thing. Thank you. Okay. All right. Chris Martin and Zach are doing all the tech tonight. And in fact, that means that, Tom, that means that everything will be recorded as it always is. So we'll send out a note to people where you can find it. And of course, we want to preserve everything that's said here. I wanted to acknowledge the chair of the English department, Jed Esty, who is here, who has supported... There is. Just stand up for a second. Thank you. All right. A couple more things, because what's going to happen after I stop doing announcements is we've got a few people who are going to speak for 5 minutes each. And I'm going to stand over here, kind of like this. Because if you multiply the number of people, and it's a small number of people, by 5 minutes, it's a lot of time. But they will be very sweet and 5 minute ish, and then at that point I will call out open mic open mic like. There are a couple people who want to add a 1 minute toast, and there might be some others, but we should warn ourselves that this is Poet Ego House tonight. We've renamed the Writers' House Poet Ego. That's why the students haven't come in. They just go right past it. Poet Ego House? I think I'm going to go down to the fraternity down the road, where there are no poet egos. But anyway, we want to get to the partying, which will happen after this gathering. But the gathering's important. A couple of other things. So the studio in the back of the house will be open all night, and we hope that you'll go back there and record a memory, a reminiscence, a funny thing about Charles or a serious thing about Charles. And then we will record that, and we will make that available to everyone and, of course, to Charles. I will be traveling around the room after the party, or after the speeches, with my folder of ModPo minute poems. And if you want to spend 5 minutes recording conversation about poem, we'd be delighted. I mean, it's very rare that we have this many talented poets in the room, so we want to take advantage of it. Here's a random announcement. Today is Charles Bernstein's birthday. Now, what we are going to do right now, this is a new arts cafe. Many of you who've read here or spoken here or whatever, you haven't really experienced all the speakers and microphones. This thing is mic'd. You know, this is like part of the old Soviet Union, this place. So we are going to sing poet style, Happy Birthday to Charles. I will set the tone. Steve Benson, do you want to sing it with me? I'd be happy. Okay, come on up. I don't even know if Steve can sing, but...
It starts with the word happy, right?
Yes.
Okay.
He's going to do his Steve Benson thing, like, I'm Steve Benson. I'm not really sure what I'm about to say next.
I'm nervous.
But this is what happens when Steve Benson performs. I have picked totally the wrong guy. Are we ready?
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Louder!
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Charles. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, Charles. Thank you, Steve. Okay, he's getting there. Two more things, and then we're going to start the 5-minute toasts. So We have speech to text up front, and it's visible if you need to be. If you're going to need after a while, you're going to need this. So come on up front. Just let me know you need a seat up front. We'll do a swap. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, one more announcement. I think two more. So we have these T-shirts. We are selling them. The Writers' House is strictly non-profit, but we figured we might as well make a profit on this. No, they're very inexpensive. I don't know. How much are they? $10. I think they're worth it. So please buy a copy. Okay, before we get started, and Liz Willis will be first. You guys are rowdy. Whoa, take it down a notch. Before we get started, so Orchid Tierney and Chris Mustaza have a special presentation for Charles. Charles, come up, please.
So we just wanted to sort of give something to Charles just as a token of our appreciation, because Charles isn't just Charles, he's a figure in our community, and we are just so, Chris and I are just so extraordinarily grateful for all that he has done for us, but also to the Kelly Writers' House and just to the community of poetry. And so we'd like to present the Charles Bernstein mixtape, which is a collection anthology from many people here. So quite a few people here have contributed poems, of reflections, thoughts, and I don't know what else to say, but just thank you, Charles, for everything. You are one of a kind. Yeah.
And because these two wonderful people are here, they're both just within weeks of getting their PhDs here from Penn with wonderful dissertation. Chris Mustaza, Orchid Tierney.
Well, there is this thing called the dissertation defense that hasn't happened yet, but whatever. You spoiled the outcome. All in favor of granting the PhD to those two, say aye. Okay. Any against? Jed, are you against? Any abstentions? Okay, you got it. Screw the dissertation defense. It says screw the dissertation. Okay, all right, here we go. Liz Willis is first, and on deck will be Johanna Drucker. Liz Willis, come on up.
It's nice to see so many people I know out there. Willie Creeley and I were talking about how this is sort of like a dream that we had like 20 years ago in a kind of strange way. Anyway, what to say about Charles Bernstein in 5 minutes or less is an interesting constraint. I met Charles, I think, in about 1987 when he came to Buffalo. And we had an argument that I don't know if he still remembers about gender and comedy and power. And, and I'm not going to repeat it, but it was an important moment for me because we were both so certain that we were right. And though he pretty much dismissed what I had to say, it was not the end of the conversation. And that was what was so instructive, that he could dismiss an idea without dismissing a person. And as a result, we went on to have amazing conversations about a whole range of things that involved a lot of other shared affinities that I don't know if I would have otherwise realized were there. And among the many interests we shared were Swinburne, Ruskin, Pater, and the Pre-Raphaelites as unlikely prototypes of the modern, which is what I was attempting to write a dissertation about. In the process of those conversations, I discovered that as polemical as Charles had a reputation for being, he often refused to dismiss something categorically. In fact, I discovered we both had a propensity for seeing the value in something that had been thrown away by others as passé, obvious, or without interest, like certain kinds of kitsch or the Rossettis, which is connected with one of the qualities that I appreciate most about Charles, which is his utter relentlessness. And I mean this in the kindest way. It's a manifestation of his intensity and his deep generosity of spirit. And I must say that that relentlessness entered my life at a time when it had a major impact. And I have to give it up to Charles for convincing me in an almost filial or parental way that it would be a good idea if I finished my dissertation, even though I was planning on abandoning it and moving on to other things. So thank you publicly very much for that. The other kind of relentlessness that I appreciate in Charles, of course, comes through in his work in the way that he can address ordinary things with such unrelenting attention that it recalculates our relation to the everyday and so realigns our thinking about relation more generally. So I just want to quote a few lines from the end of Artifice of Absorption, which was, I think, the first text of Charles's that I read, and also as a shout out to Gil Ott's great Philadelphia-based Singing Horse Press. Absorption and its many converses, reverses, is at heart a measure of the relationship between a reader and a work. Any attempt to isolate this dynamic in terms exclusively of reading or composition will fail on this account. As writers, and everyone inscribes in the sense I mean here, we can try to intensify our relationships by considering how they work. Are we putting each other to sleep or waking each other up? And what do we wake to? Does our writing stun or sting? Can we try to bring our relationship with readers to fruition? That the sight of reading become a fact of value. Thank you, Charles, for proposing that we wake each other up.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Liz. While Johanna is on her way up, I'll say that Yunte Huang is up next. And thinking about Yunte, I just want to shout out to some people who came a long way. The prize goes to Christian Buck, who came for this event from Australia. Thank you, Christian. And, I said, Christian, you've booked some readings on the East Coast. You got things to do. No, I got to go back and teach. So Australia for this party and back. Yunte, who you're going to meet in a minute, came from China for this event, and you'll meet him in a second. And a shout out to Johanna herself, who came from Los Angeles for this party. From New Haven for this party. Yeah, I was going to say, you get... I was going to say metaphysically the furthest. But Marjorie Perloff came all the way from Los Angeles, and we really appreciate that. So, and Liz came from Iowa. So, thank you for making this trip. So, and a lot of all right, New York, shout out the New Yorkers. Thank you. Okay, there you go. Right. All right. Johanna, you're up. Thank you.
I say nobody here I recognize. As a matter of fact, Frau Dr. Madam Lady Drucker, she can't be here today. So I'm here. I'm here because for 40 plus years, we have been keeping this thing under observation. I have findings to share with you. Very crucial. Very crucial. The fundamental poetical material of this creature, the genetic strains of production and reproduction, the twisted reflex of the double mind, the helical, the spherical, the replicating structure of the ludic, unleashed without any license into the world, wreaking havoc. You cannot imagine the destructive force of poems that announce themselves as not poems. Except they're about being the poem that they are not, that you do not expect to have be a poem. This statement, this is not a statement. Not really. I mean, it's not a difficult statement. I mean, without, you should know, it is not a statement really, at least. You know, stating its difficulties to show you it is really a poem, except you didn't realize it. Okay. The triple helix of the Homo poeticus of the specimen Bernstein Charles. It works its way through the material of language, and it produces an endless strain of linguisticus twisticus. We have studied this specimen for a long time. All we can say is we're hoping that the damage to serious literature and contemporary philosophy can be contained. We're looking into a language removal plan. So far, we have not progressed very far in our researches. Our last attempt was using pliers. It had very bad results. Only the tongue came out and not the language. Terrible, it was terrible, very messy. But meanwhile, we're so honored to have the chance to study so rare, so raw, so cooked, so perfect a specimen of the unusual creature, the Bernstein Charles, to get to know its habit, its habitus, smatterings and stutterings, and be with you today and look at the dubious accomplishments of this man of letters, for whom we have designated a whole new nomenclature category, Homo poeticus extraordinarius. But the perversity of this particular specimen is that he has a proclivity. Yes, you know what a proclivity is? He has a proclivity to prehensile poetics, meta-linguistic metamorphosis of the poetic frameworks, so they cancel expectations. The particularities of the self references return the poem to itself cancelled. Struck through, it lies on its back like a helpless bug, waving its rhyming lines in the air. And this thing, that thing, everything from sing-sing, bring-along, a ding-dong, ring-a-ding-dang. Remember, nothing is ever difficult unless it attacks you. Yes, we know. Poeticus Homo specimen Bernstein has committed so many crimes against the poetic code. But it lapsed at the end of the 19th century, so we cannot prosecute. The statute of limitations has fallen off our pedestal, and so we have to let this beast, this wild man of puns and doggerel, go free, unless the Southern District of New York decides to prosecute. Meanwhile, all we can do is celebrate.
That was Johanna Drucker. Johanna Drucker. Oh, boy. Thank you, Johanna. New Haven. Okay. Yunte Huang is up next, and Bruce Andrews will be on deck. Came from China, everybody.
Well, Johanna, I cannot beat that. I might as well just start speaking Chinese. Well, speaking of Chinese, I first came to know Charles when I was still an undergraduate student, Peking University, and he sent me very generously a book called The Politics of the Poetic Form, which is still, is my Bible, sort of, today. And I skip a lot of details, apparently. So after 3 years in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, I migrated north and to work with Charles, study with Charles. I remember first year, I'm so glad to see my former roommate, Joe Kushai here, and other friends. Joe will know this, that when I first arrived in Buffalo, I didn't have funding, so I had to work 3 jobs to put myself through graduate school, and for 40 hours a week. And Charles said, "You can't do that. There's no way." So he actually gave me $150 a month so that I can quit 2 of my jobs. So not all of them. so I quit. The 2 jobs I quit was one of them was cashier at a Chinese restaurant, and the other was a security guard at a Korean-owned wig store on the east side of Buffalo, which is kind of dangerous. But anyway, I kept the job of shelving books for Dr. Perloff for $5 an hour, I think. I kept that throughout. So anyway, after about 4 years, it came apparently job market time, and so I made a mistake of going on the job market in my 4th year, and I got 4 MLA interviews. I blew them all. In my 5th year, I was very depressed. I thought, man, Chinaman would never stand a chance. Getting a PhD in English and looking for an English job, teaching English. So anyway, I ran into Charles, and I was depressed. And Charles said, "Well, how about I give you a mock interview?" And so we sat down. He asked me a question, and about a few sentences into my answer, he stopped me. He said, "Yunte, I'm going to teach you something that I learned from my father, who apparently was a Jewish, worked in the Jewish garment industry. It's a clothing salesman technique." He said, "Yunte, your mistake is that you don't have any eye contact. This kind of Oriental with hell and revelation." So anyway, he said, he taught me one thing, which has been working all these years, is that he said, "Yunte, remember this. Every time you talk to people or trying to get something from them, always look them in the eye and keep telling yourself, 'I'm your guy. I'm your guy.'" Well, it worked apparently in my 5th year, and like they say, the rest is history. Speaking of history, I flew, another 10,000-mile journey 2 weeks ago for a book award. I think 2 weeks ago. I didn't win. I was a finalist, but I didn't win. And this time I try again. I know I don't have to be a winner tonight, but having Charles as my friend and mentor already makes me a winner. And I think the same for everyone here. Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you.
Yunte Huang, amazing. Thank you. You are a winner. Okay, Bruce Andrews is up, and Erica Hunt is on deck.
A portrait of Charles in his late 20s from his work. This is called "Excruciating is Not a Gerund." Abiding, accounting, acting, adding, allowing, amending, answering, ascending, asking, attending, banding, becoming, behaving, belonging, biting, blanching, blinding, blithering, blotting, blurring, boosting, breathing, bringing, buckling, buzzing, calling, camping, caring, chanting, clawing, clicking, clinging, closing, clumping, combing, coming, complicating, confusing, conjoining, constituting, contrasting, cooking, counting, cracking, crawling, creating, creeping, crossing, crying, dancing, dawning, dealing, deriving, despairing, dispelling, disturbing, dizzying, doing, drawing, drifting, drinking, dropping, dying, eating, emerging, encroaching, enfolding, erasing, exceeding, excluding, expecting, experiencing, explaining, exploding, exuding, failing, falling, feeling, fighting, filling, finding, fixing, flashing, floating, fluctuating, flying, foaming, focusing, foisting, folding, fooling, forgetting, forgiving, forming, furnishing, gagging, getting, giving, gliding, glimpsing, glowering, going, grading, groping, growing, habiting, halting, hanging, happening, harboring, having, hearing, hiding, hissing, hitting, holding, hoping, hovering, hunting, hurting, implying, inhabiting, insisting, intersecting, jumping, justifying, keeping, kicking, kissing, knowing, lacking, lashing, leaping, learning, leering, letting, likening, liking, listening, living, longing, looking, looming, losing, loving, lumbering, lurking, making, mending, miscatching, misplacing, misreading, missing, mistaking, mistyping. Mocking, moving, naming, needing, obtaining, occurring, packing, panicking, parsing, passing, peeling, peeking, peeling, peering, piling, placing, playing, pointing, popping, posing, pounding, pouring, prattling, pressing, proclaiming, projecting, propping, puffing, pulling, pumping, pushing, racing, raining, ranging, reordering, reaching, realizing, reassuring, recalling, recatching, receding, reconstituting, reeling, reflecting, refreshing, refusing, regarding, relating, remembering, rending, repeating, resembling, resisting, respecting, resuming, returning, revealing, reviewing, riddling, riding, ringing, rotating, ruffling, running, rushing, sawing, saying, seeing, seeking, sensing, sermonizing, setting, shifting, shimmering, shining, shooting, shoving, showing, sickening, sinking, sitting, skipping, skirting, sleeping, sliding, slipping, sloping, slumbering, smiling, snowing, soaring, spilling, spiraling, splashing, sporting, standing, staring, starting, striking, stripping, stumbling, submerging, surfacing, suspended, swirling, switching, taking, talking, taping, tasting, telling, thickening, thinking, throwing, thundering, tricking, touching, transfixing, transforming, trembling, tripping, trying, turning, twirling, twisting, underlining, unfolding, unseating, upturning, veering, waiting, walking, wanting, wasting, watching, weighing, whirling, whistling, wheeling, wondering, working, writing.
Misty, this is Misty right over here. When we contracted with you, you had no idea. Okay, thank you, Misty. That was something. Erica, and then Danny Snelson is on deck.
Hello, what a great occasion. All these people in one room, you know, from different eras. It's great. So I'm going to be sincere. I'm I'm not entirely, somewhat. I'm not entirely certain of the precise date I first met Charles. But there's a journal entry, February 20th, 1979. That marks the aperture, the date of a reading he gave at the grand piano of many-volumed renown with Barrett Wanton in San Francisco. I think it's possible, Johanna makes me think that it might have been before 1979, but anyhow, the entry serves as a marker of sorts of the occasion. This way there be paradox and delight, and the other way, well, it wouldn't be my way. And I have to confess the marker was a tad obscure. It says, quote, brush off your glasses. He pulls his hat on his head to keep a hold of it, a frame at a time. Now, when I read this in tandem with the PennSound recording of that same reading, he says nothing of the sort, so I don't know. Maybe I was daydreaming, maybe I was mishearing, who knows? But I'm so glad for PennSound, one of Charles's many collaborations from which we all benefit. The poetry community is richer, right, for PennSound. But I suppose it was a mishearing, one which Charles would approve of, maybe a daydream, the tangent being the point, or the point leading to another point, no era, but in things. But the recording of that reading returned me to the person who wrote the journal entry, a person who most of the time I can recollect but dimly. Charles' reading consists of poems ripe with spiraled beginnings, each line beginning again, not where the last left off, but as if in some other aspect of matter, material, dailiness, and especially speech effects, the plethora of voice and rhetorics, the pataquarical dodges and feints evident in poetic and ordinary language, and each poem a petri dish of language and culture. In this reading, I heard the possibility of moving past the cemetery of poetic diction and the tombstones of fixed opinion to something on the brink of legibility, a vote of confidence in the reader, resting the vote of confidence in the reader wherever she may be, eating lunch, moody or mumbling, about to step off the bus, reading before her surgery, under a library light, ready to write something herself. Charles's reading on February 20th, 1979 demonstrates the hypotactic beginner's mind, those sentences starting off determined to dissolve. Structure, tense tempo, rough topographies of preconception, not a conquered landscape or the unmapped just waiting to be pinned down, not an alibi or a claim check, no, or our predetermined lost luggage for something or someone offset, but to be the canvas for the air and the mind and the heart with loopholes, puns, caverns, and stutters that suture language, if we but slow down to listen, look over the grist and gravel. Now, for the many, 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 many of us who are fortunate to know Charles, and as far as I can tell, this includes a cast of thousands, Charles has been consistent in the intensity and the variety of his interests. Symphonic comes to mind, but also deliciously and wickedly funny. From Andrews to Ashbery to Dunbar to Scalapino, from Levitsky to Stein, from Blau to Plessis and Foster to Bersenbrugge, and Howe, from Hannah Weiner to Steve McCaffrey to Perloff to Quinault to Jabez to Wittgenstein, from Patricia Spear-Jones to Yunte Huang, from Goldsmith to Bach and back, from Osman to Morris, from Adorno to Benjamin, and anagrammatically, from Aigner to Grenier. Oh, you get what I mean. For in his work, which is polymath and polyform and weirdly welcoming, he beguiles us into an appreciation of language and its possibilities. Now, my little speech would not be complete without mention of Charles's formidable warmth and loyalty, how his loves animate him, family, people, poetry, and the sheer good fortune one feels that he is your friend and mentor, and will write a letter of recommendation in his sleep. Pitch and pith matter, and I have found him to be a steadfast ally, one who talks a lot but also listens in the large rooms that he often finds himself in, as well as in the hush arbors where we make sense from silence. So I offer here a partial sense of Charles Bernstein, 40 years condensed into 600 words. And so here's a poem. rewritten for the occasion for Charles. If fuzzy logic cooks rice, if the yellow pages, more or less, recite, if we ever decide that the mute button stays off, forfeiture's plenitude will cough up its meaning, and we will exchange it like a passing thought, the daily traffic of drive-by subjects, the multitude slowing down sufficient to embrace the person of the moment. Thank you, Charles.
Erica Hunt. Thank you, Erica. Danny is up next, and Jena is on deck. I just wanted to pause and I just wanted to pause. They are not scheduled to, by their choice, not to speak, but we would be remiss, especially on the birthday of this character in the family, Susan B. Susan, what can we say? We're going to put our hands together. I don't know why, but I think because of some very obvious things. And Felix, I don't see Felix. And Felix and Gabe, where's Felix in the back? And Gabe. And Susan Bernstein, Charles's cousin, who you were going to meet a little later. So to the family, thank you. And we all have our different reasons for thanking you. So Danny, come on up, and then Jen is on deck.
I will keep this short. To Charles, here, I was taking the toast seriously. So this will be a toast, and I fear quite sincere in a moment. 5 minutes, of course, is an impossibility, but so would be 5,000. Of course, Charles tells us poetry, like the toast or the joke, it's all in the timing. So bad. Timing is tricky. Retrospection is suspect, and it's as if the clocks by their very gears had hold of us. Gathering time in pages, ephemera, and memoranda, I've spent the last months trying for a toast, for a few proper words that might be tailored to the occasion. My first thought with just 5 minutes was that I could lead a kind of group sing-along of 1 to 100. I don't know if many of you have heard this great song by Charles, but I figured there's a lot of screaming involved. It might be better to spare the throat lest it spoil the whiskey. Quote, "There is an hour to come," said he, "when all of us shall throw back our glasses. Take it not amiss, beloved friend, if I wear these few words till then." End quote. Perhaps it's the lapsed Mormon in me, but I couldn't resist the idea of attempting to peek through the veil of Charles Bernstein tonight. Forgive me, minister, professor. So I started typing, retyping, and overtyping, as those of you who have seen Veil might see, not overprinting, but overtyping, mingling my recollections with collections typed elsewhere, seeking insight, or at least oversight, in underlines and, overextended rhyme schemes. That's when, rifling through the archive, I found this box. Shall I open? It's a lost set of documents from the Bernstein archive circa 1979. Okay. That's a really stupid lie. I just made these. I made them cheaply too, on stolen time and misappropriated Xeroxes and pilfered paper from my home institution. I was taught, of course, the arts of noble theft and poetic deception. But these are at least facsimiles or printed facsimiles of poor JPEGs from the Eclipse archive of the first 4 books by Charles, printed over the top of each other, the titles of which read in sequence almost make a sentence. Asylum's parsing shades of poetic justice. Here, they're presented in a veiled edition of 26 lettered copies, which I'll invite you to grab. But in these pages, finally, I found the insight, or at least the oversight, for a toast. Mystically, I thought, these first works, layered as such, all somehow inscribe the present moment. That is to say, in these pages, we might find this moment, this celebration, and this gathering, or so I've been led to misread. And so, without further ado, a quick toast entitled, quote, "A close misreading of Bernstein's first works in anticipation of April 4th, 2019, or an unre-deveiling of Asylum's parsing shades of poetic justice, or a nod to ancient astronaut theory as literary method, and/or direct/hit." So I'm just going to read just a couple of these here. You can see the titles are overlaid. Okay. But to say it sort of comes to you, this is ceremonial. It's like a statement of method. It's like eerie, right? You all feel that? Okay. You all feel that. Quote, "You think of a perpetual vacation, poetic justice for Charles Bernstein." I mean, that speaks for itself. This arrangement outside, faculty politics, the consequence of breaking diffuses over his world. I mean, who writes a poem with the title Faculty Justice in 1979, 10 years before he joins a faculty, which I find really quite remarkable. This is of course, in Poetic Justice. And I wanted to just turn, in closing, to that page where I think we can find an actual toast for the evening in the poem Faculty Justice, overlaid with 3 other titles. A poem that asks us, from parsing, "It is as if I want you to get up close and look in." Here we find, quote, "As if this future subject, sometime I wouldn't remember what company it fringed together. A shimmering kind of moment can take a particular turn to, quote, my inspiration, my reflection, my future, my wit, my charm, my memory, my incomparability." So at last, the rest of these I'll leave you to divine, and there are many. But for now, with unabashed sincerity, I wanted to raise my glass to mentor and friend in kinship and with love. Charles, like so many here, I simply would not be here, obviously not here tonight, but literally, more generally, I would not be here without you. And everything you do. To say nothing, my world is shaped by you in countless ways. I am forever grateful and endlessly inspired. Here's to Charles, to the lifting of his professor's veil, finally, to all the futures yet to be inscribed. To Charles.
These are being handed out now. Danny Snelson, thank you so much. So next up is Jena Osman, and Ron Silliman is on deck.
Everyone got one?
Here, Brizzy. Here, Brizzy. Pass them around.
Charles, you know I hate doing stuff like this, but I'm doing it for you. All right. I first met Charles in 1988 when he was a visiting writer at Brown. I remember having an awkward conference with him about my work. He seemed amused and puzzled by this idea that I would show him some bad poems and he was supposed to just sit and talk about them. The following year, I moved to New York and eventually found my way to the Ear In reading series. Even though we had only had that one awkward chat, Charles greeted me like an old friend and introduced me to all the poets who frequented the series at that time. That included Fiona Templeton, Bruce Andrews, Jessica Grimm, Jackson McClough, Hannah Weiner, Abigail Child. I think Johanna Drucker was there too at that time, and many others. I was warmly welcomed into that community thanks to that introduction. A couple of years later, Charles mentioned that he had started the poetics program up at SUNY Buffalo with Susan Howe, and that sounded good, and that's where I went. What I remember about Charles's classes were thick and heavy spiral-bound photocopy packets, thick as phone books, and filled with an eye-opening variety of works that, in all honesty, I'm still processing, and decades later. I also remember that his classes were extremely crowded. He told me he didn't believe in course caps, that if someone was accepted into a program and wanted to take a course, they should be able to take it. Ultimately, I think Charles's pedagogy is about saying yes. Yes to the overflow enrollments, yes to an enormous array of materials that couldn't possibly be covered in a semester, yes to inviting poet friends to his classes and just having a good conversation, yes to insane dissertation ideas, yes to making all of his pedagogical materials available online, yes to never taking the institution too seriously, yes, in fact, to institutional critique, yes to literary autonomy, yes to the minor is the major, yes to a diverse modernism, yes to archives, yes to close listening, yes to not playing favorites, yes to jokes, yes to always ending class with laughter, yes to the town diner, yes to martinis, yes to a limited but very funny acting career, which doesn't really have to do with this pedagogy, but it's going in this list anyway. Yes to poetry, yes to infectious excitement about poetry, yes to funding nutty literary journal ideas. And at this point, I should say that Juliana Spar, my partner in poetics program Crime, helped me write this list. We sometimes worried he was exhausted or that he had some kind of mania. He must say no sometime. But yes to that letter of recommendation, yes to that blurb, yes to introductions, yes, he'll make time for you, yes to another martini with an olive, yes to all the poetry from all corners of the world. And I doubt retirement is going to slow him down, but this man deserves to retire. Charles models a generous, fun, and kind pedagogy, which is also a model for how to live in this world, and I thank him for that. Thank you, Charles.
Jena Osman. Thank you, Jena. Wow, that was inspiring. Thank you. Ron, and then Tracie Morris is on deck.
I think I fall on the sincere side of these speeches. But of course, I have to begin with a song, which is the title of this little piece, which I will teach to you and we will all sing, and then I can actually go forward. With apologies to Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein. It goes like this. The first time I met Charlie, rhymes with jolly. The first time I met Charlie, the grapes were on the ground, and I ran round and round and round and round and round and round. Think you can remember that? Okay, all of us. The first time I met Charlie, the grapes were on the ground, and I ran round and round and round and round and round and round. Thank you. We had corresponded back when he was still an undergrad at Harvard, but he graduated and moved. Vancouver, was it? Or Santa Barbara? I wasn't very clear. But in 1974, I was corresponding with a lot of people, living in San Francisco on Potrero Hill with Barrett Watton, working in the prison movement, editing titles, just starting to write Ketchak. One evening around dusk, there was a knocking at the door, and there he was, Charles Bernstein, tall and dashing, with the same movie star good looks that would later become immortalized in Gus Van Zant's Finding Forrester. If you look on the IMDb cast list, he is listed ahead of Matt Damon. Accompanied by two young and beautiful women, Susan B., who was not yet a bee, and, I believe, Tony Simon. In those days, because of my work, I tried to be careful as to whom I let in. Once, it had been a reporter from the Examiner inquiring if I knew where Patty Hearst was being held by her kidnappers, which happily I did not. Plus, Barry was working on some writing at the moment. So I suggested that instead of coming in, we should go out to the local watering hole. The women decided that this was not for them and informed Charles that they would meet him wherever it was they were staying as they headed west back toward the rest of San Francisco, while Charles and I walked maybe 3 blocks east to a red-painted Victorian whose ground floor held the tavern, the Garden of Earthly Delights. I kid you not, Hieronymus Bosch. Even for Pot Hill, the garden was an offbeat location for a bar, neither on the main drag nor even the long road that ran from Hunter's Point through Dogpatch to downtown via the Lefty O'Doul Bridge at China Basin, where, if I had thought this through a little better, I could have taken Charles to the waterfront Mission Rock Resort, though it had a rep for being crowded and raucous at that hour with all the pleasure boaters coming back ashore for the night. Maybe I was concerned about running into my windsurfing cousin, not a literary type, though he had Ron Lowenson's old job as a printer for the Chronicle. The garden, however, was largely empty but for a rock band that had set up to play for the evening. The guitarist for the band, John Clark, was someone I knew, soon to be a co-worker of Robert Grenier, Erica Hunt, and Tinker Green, as a night shift proofreader with the law firm Browbeat, Flog 'em, and Harass 'em. Also the younger brother of the poet Tom Clark, at that moment a rather vocal detractor of all things language writing, author of the much republished Stalin as Linguist, in which both Barrett and I are alternately posed as Stalin. But I had always liked John, who seemed to have no such illusions, and I still do. Charles and I, however, were not merely the largest contingent in the bar. We were the only folks anyone in the band had ever met, or I was at least. So while we talked, or tried to, getting to know one another in that tentative pre-internet sort of way, talking poetics through poets, he mentioned Robin Blazer, Toby Lurie, the band, hard-charging with the blues tinge, played to us and at us with a gusto that was unmistakable, also unavoidable. So we shouted as best we could, and we have been shouting ever since.
Ron Silliman, that is fantastic. Thank you, Ron. Tracie Morris is up, and Peter Gizzi is on deck.
Wow. This is like the who's who of obscure poets that most people don't know outside of our circle. Wow. Friends, in other words. So being a literalist before I became an experimental soundport, this is actually a toast too, and I will be brief because Al is like, wow. Thank you, Al and Jessica and everybody for putting this together. I would like to offer a toast to fellow Brooklynite, Charles Bernstein, as well as to his family, who has helped him to make him the success and his success possible over all these years. In fact, my brief toast is about that, our ties, blood and others, our community. There are many who talk about Charles's singular acumen as a poet, teacher, and other kinds of artists. But who is any individual? Who are we without each other? Would we be here in this literal writer's house that Charles contributed his heart's brick and mortar to in order to make it a home? In countless ways, we have seen him do this, in quiet, unannounced, personal ways that the beneficiary will never know of, and in public ways, for example, at my dissertation defense when he said, "Now we have to help her get a good job." What does it mean to do a good job? Is it when you get a retirement party? Is it when you do good or when you do well? Is it the detritus of books, poems, recordings, sounds, jackets? Despite our care about the archives, it's none of these things. Why would we care? It isn't the thought that counts, it's the feeling. Ours is not a linear world, even though we attend to the line. Our home is the type that love builds. It's why we care, celebrate, thank. It's why we say, you don't have to work so hard. Go do what you want. Because we hold each person precious who loves us in return and for whom we care back. It's beyond language. It's beyond poetry. It is why we are compelled to utter what the heart in its beating says. Happy birthday, Charles. And here's to a fruitful and joyful retirement full of love.
Tracie Morris. Thank you, Tracie. Peter Gizzi's up, and Davy Knittle is on deck.
Charles Bernstein is a force of nature. His work is uncanny, acute, and often funny. He is a stylist extraordinaire whose indelible voice, distinct, lively, and personal, runs through everything he writes, no matter the genre. His output is astounding, and his work as a community builder is legion. One could not imagine the life of poetry in this country without his generous and formidable presence. For almost 50 years, he's enriched every aspect of the scene as a force for good, for positive pluralism, for welcoming the young, all with his indefatigable energy and curiosity. I know I'm far from the only one here who couldn't imagine their life without Charles's goodwill and true support. We first met through Roberta Tejada in the early 80s. Charles read from controlling interest, and I was instantly struck by his intensity and force. From the first, he was kind and open to me. He was enormously supportive of my little magazine, Oblique, and happily sent me poems over the life of the journal. Later, when I wanted to join the poetics program, Bob and Charles went to bat for me. I hadn't taken the GREs and didn't have a background that suggested I was a viable PhD candidate. But Charles believed in me and did the heavy lifting with the administration to get me in. When Juliana and I proposed a festival of emerging poets which became Writing for the New Coast, Charles was right there, instantly behind it, to help us negotiate the SUNY system to acquire funds. And I must add, he worked tirelessly all those years to support all of his students as he fought with the department to build out the program. A year into my studies, I was feeling out of sorts. Buffalo was theory-heavy, and it just wasn't my thing. Charles wisely said, let others do what they do, and you do what you do. It was sound advice, and I took it to heart. It was also characteristic advice. Charles can always see the value in other poets. So many other poets, even or especially when they didn't quite fall into line with the academy or a reigning style or a popular movement. He humanized what can often be a dehumanizing environment by recognizing and encouraging individuals to follow their own instincts, trust their true selves, and find a way forward. I tell you this not so much to focus on myself, but to provide one of many, many examples of the great generosity and energy Charles put into the work and lives of others to foster and extend the art he loves. During my time in grad school, first at Brown, then at the Poetics program, I was fortunate to have beloved poets in my life. When I think back to that time, I am grateful for the deep support of Keith and Rosemarie, C.D., Bob, Susan, Liz, and certainly Charles. And Charles did that thing that only a true mentor can do, teach by example and accept you as a peer. Charles is family and has been a dear friend all these years, and my life has been made so much better for it. I am proud and lucky that I come from somewhere astonishing, that I belong to something truly momentous, and that I get to be part of a story of an ever-widening circle. Since we are here to not only celebrate Charles the teacher, Charles the scholar, Charles the instigator, Charles the agitator, Charles the failed comic, Charles the friend, but Charles the poet, let me close by reading a few excerpts from a longish poem of his that I love. Solidarity is the name we give to what cannot hold. And I feel it demonstrates his positive pluralism, his reach and humor, and why his Quicksilver work is uncategorizable. I am a nude formalist poet, a sprung syntax poet, a multi-track poet, a wondering poet, a social expressionist poet, a Baroque poet, a constructivist poet, an idealectical poet. I am a New York poet in California, a San Francisco poet on the Lower East Side, an objectivist poet in Royaumont, a surrealist poet in Jersey, a Dada poet in Harvard Square, a Zom poet in Brooklyn, a Mertz poet in Iowa, a Cubo-futurist poet in Central Park. I am a Buffalo poet in Providence, a London poet in Cambridge, a Kootenai School of Writing poet in Montreal. I am a serial poet, a paratactic poet, a disjunctive poet, a discombobulating poet, a montage poet, a collage poet, a hypertextual poet, a nonlinear poet, a conceptual poet. I am a vernacular poet, a talk poet, a dialect poet, a heteroglossic poet, a slang poet, a demotic poet, a punning poet, a comic poet. And I am none of these things, nothing but the blank wall of my aversions writ large in disappearing ink.
Peter Gizzi. Before Davy comes up, a couple of shout-outs. Will Creeley is here. Where is Will? Will is representing the Creeley family. Penn was not able to come. The partnership of Bob and Charles was extraordinarily important, and we all remember and miss Bob Creeley. So thank you, Will, for coming tonight to represent the Creeleys. When I was awarding prizes for people coming a distance, I forgot, because Michael Davidson has been here so happily often recently, I forgot to shout out to Michael, who came from San Diego, I think, or La Jolla. So thank you, Michael, for being here. And Ernesto came from Texas, I believe. Is that right? Yes, I think. Eduardo came from Texas, not Ernesto. Eduardo, thank you. Espina, right. Thank you so much for coming. So Davy's up next, and then Marjorie.
Before Charles was a person I knew, he was familiar to me as a voice. In 2008, I began listening to Charles interview poets whose work was then being taught to me in my undergraduate courses by the wonderful poet and Charles's former student, Elizabeth Willis. Through close listening and line break, I got to know Charles first as a poet who had expansive and generative conversations with other poets. Listening to Charles was like watching a basketball game. An opportunity to witness and track his busy and improvisatory movement across a plane he shared with and opened up for others in the room. I think of conversation as Charles's primary genre. His writing, poetry, essays, and work uninterested in being categorized is often both conspiratorial and emboldening, and reads startlingly like listening to him talk. Being in the classroom with him is equally improvisatory, something I've learned from Charles, but also from being in Elizabeth's classroom and those of Charles's other former students, Jena Osman and Julia Block, as they perform a pedagogical mode that's both singularly admirable and also bears resemblances to the generous invention Charles models and asks of his students. Certainly every time I make the argument to my students that it's writing that's the scene of action, every time I ask the students in my classroom to think with me about things that happen in poems, in essays, and in their own work, Charles is there. The Charles who appears in my classroom is the Charles of the essay Stray Straws and Straw Men, in which he explains that in his view, quote, writing itself is seen as an instance of reality, fantasy, experience, event, rather than recounting one. It's the Charles of the dollar value of language, in which he demands that language must be, quote, taken out of the service of the capitalist project. Thanks, Charles. A position he's held for decades and has continued to support in the increasingly profit-driven university over the past 30 years from his first class at UCSD. The Charles who I'm aware of in my teaching practice is the sound studies Charles, who argues that the voicing of the poem is the poem. The Charles of PennSound, whose curatorial work has brought the voice of hundreds of poets into so many of our classrooms and living rooms and train commutes and walks around the block. It's the Charles of the essay Close Listening, Poetry and the Performed Word, in which he writes, quote, a poem understood as a performative event, and not merely as a textual entity, refuses the originality of the written document in favor of the plural event of the work. In Charles's practice, every opportunity to share space with another human, in a meeting, in the classroom, at a poetry reading, becomes a plural event of its own, a chance to collaboratively listen and improvise. 2 summers ago, I went to visit Charles at his home in Brooklyn. We sat in his yard and looked up at some tall poles with pieces of former hardware attached. He asked me what I thought the hardware was for, and we sat in our lawn chairs and craned our necks up at the poles for a minute and just looked. Eventually, with a little disappointment and after a number of bad guesses, I said I didn't know, and he told me that it had previously been the rope and pulleys for a clothesline system across the alley, anchored to the houses on either side. As his yard became a classroom, we gazed up at the pole and the former sites of the pulleys and talked to each other through imagining pulling laundry into the house. What I learned in the classroom from Charles as a student is that the bravest and most interesting pedagogy is based on a theory of collaborative improvisation, of talking to one another until you get somewhere. And in Charles's classroom, I learned the practice as well as the theory to dissent, even from Charles, by participating, to take risks with language as a way of being and writing on my own terms. What I continue to learn from Charles every time I sit down with a student or a sentence or a book is that working with language is a fundamentally adaptive practice. And the most ethical way to adapt is to be generous, to offer your time and your words and your close listening, a practice for which I'm lucky and so grateful to have Charles as my model and as my guide.
Davy Knittle. Thank you, Davy. So Marjorie Perloff is up and Bob Perelman is on deck. All the way from Los Angeles. Here she is.
I'm going to begin with 1983, An Ordinary Afternoon in Pacific Palisades. My former graduate student turned avant-garde publisher Douglas Messerly, who sends you all his regards, brought to meet me his friend, the then fledgling, I thought fledgling, I see from what everybody says here that he was already doing a lot in the mid-70s, Erica knew him and so forth, but I didn't. I was an academic. Those aren't the poet. I knew nothing really about Charles, and I was a little bit skeptical. Doug had given me a copy of a mimeographed and stapled 63-page book, more properly pamphlet, called Shade, which Doug's press Sun and Moon had published in 1978. On the very first page, I read, "Hear, forget. There are simply tones, cloudy, breezy, birds, and so on. Sit down with it. It's time now. There is no more natural sight. Anyway, transform everything." I had no idea what to do with this poem. that went on for another 13 lines. Where was here, and what was I being told to forget or sit down with? And the other poems in shade were even stranger. Now, judging from these poems, I was expecting a rather solemn and withdrawn young man, frankly. I thought Charles was going to be one of these nerdy people, quiet, and I thought he would just sit on the sidelines being bored while Doug and I did the talking. Now, instead, young 30-something Charles, never Chuck or Charlie. That's very important. Notice this person is never called Chuck or Charlie and couldn't be. And think about what that means. He turned out to be not only very good looking, with his black curly hair, but also totally charming and approachable. As approachable as the boy next door. With the proviso that as seasoned New Yorkers, Charles and I probably both hated the boys next door. And the girls next door, too. In New York, we don't bother with the boys next door, right? Now, sitting by the pool, we were immediately in sync, and we were soon talking, as we have been for the last 35 years, simultaneously. It makes people It makes people furious. It used to make my husband furious that we're always talking at the same time with no break. And there are many people who have said to me, this is just intolerable. Until I looked up that Gertrude Stein said that was a sign of genius, talking simultaneously. Did you know that? So we felt better. We did it all the time. Our bond was strengthened by the realization that we had both gone to and found faintly absurd the ethical culture school. When Charles told me he was not only not asked to continue to the upper school, did you all know that? He flunked out, more or less. He's not asked to continue, which is like saying he couldn't go past the 6th grade there. But had instead taken the initiative to go to Bronx Science, I knew we were destined to be great friends. And that leads me to something nobody much talks about, which is that Charles is extremely practical. I've never met another poet who is so practical, and I've never quite understood that. He can fix your computer, put in a new program, reformat your webpage, find the right restaurant in Yelp in 30 seconds. I never know how he does all that, but you just mentioned, I'm coming to New York, and we're going to be in the 70s. In 2 seconds, he will have looked that up. And so he's very practical and down to earth. Now, perhaps all this know-how derives from his ability to look with X-ray vision at the New York West Side world, where one overhears things like, I'd rather be in meat than in underwear. That's a line of Charles's I just love. I say to friends, I'd rather be in meat than in underwear. That business talk. Or funny, peculiar, or funny, ha-ha. And if you're not a New Yorker of a certain kind, you don't know that line. But that was a staple of my childhood. You asked friends this all the time. How was it? Was it funny, peculiar, or funny, ha-ha? And I only realized then that, in fact, in Content Stream, Charles transformed that into funny, odd, or funny, peculiar, which is, of course, all wrong, thus denying the reader any choice at all in the dark city, which is our habitat. After our first meeting, I was enthusiastic, but on first hearing Charles read, I was hooked. And you have to hear him read, I think, because it's so amazing. What a reader, what a performer. Who can resist Charles's readings of The Simply or Disrafism or later All the Whiskey in Heaven? It's currently unfashionable to talk of the poet's voice, much less a unique voice. But the fact is that Charles's creation of voice is indeed unique, and I'm happy a few other people have brought that up today. Even when it's in the libretto Shadow Time, he speaks in the voice of Walter Benjamin. We know it's Charles. I know my vacillations Jane has faced, make strange connections. I go full throttle in one direction, then arc my thought against itself. A bow forever waiting for an arrow. That's Charles, a bow forever waiting and fielding the arrow that flieth by night. A bow on target as Charles's language transforms everything he hears and sees into the epic theater that chronicles our insane moment. It's Charles who has found a way to think outside, it's a quote, us, the self-enclosing circle that bury us alive and make us deaf even to the dead. So let me therefore salute the incomparable poet. And for me personally, in Proust's words, and I use Proust's words because Charles has no interest in Proust or in fiction in general very much, but in Proust's words of dedication of À la recherche du temps perdu, l'incomparable ami.
Marjorie Perloff. Bob Perelman is up, and Susan Howe is on deck And then I'm going to tell you what's going to happen after that. So hang on. Bob and then Susan. And Bob also traveled a long way, didn't you? I think of him as coming back home, but he came from Berkeley. So thanks, Bob.
So far so good, you know? No, this has really been it's fantastic, and I think such a testament to Charles already, just the energy, variety, and inventive brilliance. So this, I should have been earlier because this is kind of being the straight man, but I'm going to just read this anyway. Charles is leaving town, but there's really no reason to frown. This is sort of a refusal to mourn Charles' retirement. You know? Charles has always been a New Yorker, and Philadelphia and Penn have been lucky to have his active company for the past few decades. It's been a two-way street, as Penn has been an enormously fortunate place for him. The scale of his accomplishment here is enormous. Large, palpable acts like the creation of PennSound and harder to quantify myriad activities that have helped establish the liveliness of poetics here. The long range and the immediate are all of a piece, continuous and contiguous. And beyond Penn, there's been his effect as publisher, as all-purpose entrepreneur, his global poetic travels and connectivity. Charles is worthy of that accolade, so beloved in my day by Penn administrators, eminence. But seriously, he's worthy of our gratitude. Charles entered the academy by a species of virgin birth. But for someone who arrived without the customary credential, he's made quite a mark. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say he's changed the field, but that would be too singular and heroic a way of putting it, when one of the basic virtues of the way Charles does things is that he does them by connection, collaboration, networking, enthusiasm, generosity, dependability, and the constant application of his superbly common-sense imagination. Yet at the same time, he himself is an example of the poetry he so continually espouses and works so hard at Penn and beyond, constantly, it would seem. With his unquenchable appetite for pratfall, his insistence on comedy, malaprop, anti-mastery, Charles is at the same time one of the most learned poets of our era. Not that pratfall should be separated from learning, in Charles' case, when he is always combining the two sides, foregrounding the virtuosity of pratfall and applying pratfall's unpredictable swerves to what might otherwise be the static forms of knowledge. This way of doing things, where learning is always in motion as it disavows mastery, is as accessible to the new student as to the wily veteran. It is why Charles is such a great teacher, such an amusing and instructive essayist, such a great poet. By my emphasis on flexibility, I don't mean to suggest that Charles doesn't take positions. Throughout his career, he has been a ferocious defender of his values, both poetic and political. He has been exemplary in speaking truth to power. In the mid-1980s, there was the essay defending the radicalness of William Carlos Williams's writing, The Academy in Peril, which I remember reading with such sharp pleasure. As I read Charles's name for what he was attacking, official verse culture, I felt instantly how effective it was on a large scale. That was 1985. Just now there's ballad laid bare by its devices, even a bachelor machine for the MLA, that argues through its aggressive twang for a living wage for university adjuncts. Charles has been actively addressing present circumstances for decades, before Penn and at Penn, and his poetic activism will continue after Penn. His new book, Near Miss, is certainly one of many tokens of this. It's exciting to read, and its variety is cheering, and variousness is not usually a long-lasting virtue among poets. Sorry to say. The roster of his many students is long, and to start listing furthers my optimism as to the conditions of poetry. Jena Osman, Juliana Spar, Ben Friedlander, Kristen Gallagher, Sarah Dowling, to begin naming. Many people in this room, obviously. These and others who have worked with Charles are not spreading a singular poetics. While Charles is active on a scale comparable to Olson and Creeley, and while he doesn't distance himself from their example, as a teacher and influence, he differs from them in one major way. Some of Olson's and of Creeley's teaching produced imitation, There were Creeleyisms and Olsonisms, but there are no Charlesisms. Not that Charles isn't always emphatically Charles. He is, never more so than when he's reveling in non-identical language. Charles has never separated out poetry from his teaching, which is why he has been so interesting to young poet scholars. Where better to get contact with the whole art than by studying with him? But that particular good thing has come to an end. Thankfully, poetry and poetics will not abate at Penn, nor, I trust, will Charles' poetic activity abate. As I say, just look at his new book. To quote one line from it, all good things come to a beginning. It's nice to admire a close friend so thoroughly, and it's probably good for you, too. There's a deep, deep lesson there for poets. Charles has been good for many people, good for his students, good for Kelly Writers House, good for Penn, good for poetics programs, plural, and good for poets, plural, good for the art, the irreducibly plural art. Let me close by saying that I'm looking forward to Charles' continued activity.
Thank you, Bob Perelman. Susan Howe is up next, and then I'm going to try to set the stage for what will happen after that. Thank you for coming all this way, Susan Howe. It's great to see you again back here.
Oh, dear. All I can say is, to repeat Bob Perelman, all good things come to a beginning. And I remember that, Charles, you used to say to me bitterly, no good deed remains unpunished. That was another one. But what can I say? I mean, I've known in the indefatigable, peripatetic poet, philosopher, essayist, performer, translator, teaching colleague, fellow, difficult, or eccentric poet, Charles Bernstein, for all my writing life. Now, admittedly, I was a late blooming writer, having been a painter first, and he was a very early bloomer. Nevertheless, our paths crossed. I think it was in the early 1980s, but the late 70s. I remember doing a WBAI, doing an interview with Bruce and Charles for About Language magazine. Never were there two greater mansplainers than I thought at that moment. I couldn't believe it. I totally, my little sentence is a little sliver, and then woo, words. But we remained friends ever since. And he doesn't mansplain, it's a kind of different thing. But, anyway, I want to say that ever since, all these years later, in my sense of what matters in my life, in my poetry, and in my living, Susan B., Charles, Emma, and Felix were and are family to me and to all my children. But I have to say that Charles is one of the fastest email answerers. Do you know how? And that's a part of his generosity. He's so generous. I can always know I'll get something immediately back from him that's caring. So, as you all know, the spirit of Robert Creeley hangs over our lives in a major way, and we fell, both degreeless, basically, into this poetics program at SUNY Buffalo that profoundly changed our lives, and I hope students' lives. And it was a great moment, a great 10 years, we'll say. And anyway, sort of in connection with that, because we just kind of we did fall into it. Virgin birth, as was said. I wonder why the name Charles is so omnipresent in my psyche and work. I grew up near the Charles River. One of my favorite authors as a child and as an old woman is Charles Dickens. Charles Olson was a major influence on my early poetry and my two prose books. They would be inconceivable with Charles Olson. Then I became obsessed with the fate of King Charles I of England and his trial and execution. Who knows? But it resulted in a bibliography of the King's Book, or Icon Basilica. Shortly after the Icon, Charles Bernstein and I found ourselves at SUNY Buffalo's full professors. Charles even had a chair in this PhD program. Later, during the Buffalo years, up popped Charles Sanders Peirce for some inexplicable reason, resulting in another odd book, Pierce Arrow. So I thought, what better at this event for our Charles than to read from a passage from the Charles Dickens, The Personal History of David Copperfield, that I used in the Icon Basilica. This relates to, I don't know if you've all read David Copperfield, but you should have. Anyway, this is Mr. Dick. His full name is Richard Babley, the eccentric character who's obsessed with work on his own memorial, from which he is constantly distracted by thoughts of King Charles's head. And this sort of relates to the position we found ourselves in at Buffalo. I was going away when he directed my attention to the kite, said David Copperfield. What do you think of that for a kite, he said. I answered that it was a beautiful one. I should think it must have been as much as 7 feet high. I made it. We'll go and fly it, you and I, said Mr. Dick. Do you see this? He showed me that it was covered with manuscript, very closely and laboriously written, but so plainly that as I looked along the lines, I thought I saw some allusion to King Charles I's head again in 1 or 2 places. There's plenty of string, said Mr. Dick, and when it flies high, it takes the facts a long way. That's my manner of diffusing them. I don't know where they may come down. It's according to circumstances and the wind and so forth. But I take my chance of that. Anyway, thank you, beloved Charles. I don't know what you guys are going to do without him.
Susan Howe. Thank you, Susan. Friends, I hope you will agree that those who spoke did a wonderful job. Yeah. And I hope you will agree that that was a difficult thing to do. I called it Poet Ego's house earlier. I mean, forget that. There are extraordinary poet relationships in the room, many more than the 13 or 14 people who just spoke. So forgive us, because now we're moving to something. It's going to be brief, right? It's going to be very brief. But there are some people who love Charles, who've worked with Charles, who very much should have been one of those 13, but just the way things went. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tighter hand of emceeing and moderating now. But there are some folks we want to hear from. Just to anticipate the end of that, which will come soon. We have lots and lots of barbecue. The meat side on the right side. We have the vegan side on the left. There is a lot of wine and a lot of beer. And does anybody know that Charles likes whiskey? We got a case of whiskey. Thank you, Christian Buck. The studio I'll say this again when we're done here, but the studio is open, and we hope you will go back. Even if you already spoke, hope you'll go back into the studio, take a few minutes. Zach Gardner will be back there and record some of your thoughts about Charles. You know he will do some close listening to that. I also want to say, and this doesn't mix well with the barbecue, but it mixes well with the whiskey. We at the Writers' House have produced a huge cake because it is a birthday. So there's that. So I also think we should thank Misty in the middle of this thing. I mean, holy cow, what a job. Okay. So I know that Michael Davidson wants to say a word, Susan Bernstein. I know that Jack Krick would also like to, and I'm sure there are a few others, but I will strictly limit it because we're talking about 1 minute toasts, and then we all want to hang out. All right, I want to make 2 announcements myself in lieu of a speech. No speech, but 2 announcements. One is I absolutely should not be making. You'll find out that in a second. Okay, the first is a recollection of Charles's coming from Buffalo. We met down here after his talk for the English department and the Writers' House community. It was quite an ambitious talk, and it went very well because we offered him the job, and he came. And the first conversation we had, he said, I'm really glad to be coming here. My commute has been cut down by, how much did we cut that commute down? A lot, a fourth, a fifth. He said, I just really want to kind of semi-retire. I'm not going to do much here. I just, thanks so much. I'm glad the Writers' House is here, and this is so great. I don't have to run any programs or any series. Okay. And then he said, come over to my office sometime when I moved in. So I went over there, and I looked, and there was reel-to-reel tapes, cassette tapes, boxes of shit, nothing labeled. I brought my stuff with me. I have this idea. I think we should combine with all of your stuff down here at the Writers' House and all of my stuff and all of the world's tapes, because in 2003 nobody was doing this. We should create this thing, and I have a name for it, he said. And it wasn't Buffalo Sound. It was PennSound. And he and I co-directed PennSound from that moment, and Chris Mustaza was there. And here's my announcement. The announcement is simply, he's going to retire, he's not going to teach, he's not going to get a salary from the English department. Is that right, Jed? As of what, June 30th? No salary. However, he will remain. And even more avidly now that he's had more time. No, he's really said this. The co-director with me of PennSound, more than ever going forward, PennSound. So look in your basements and your attics. Jack Krick, we need some more tapes. Go find them. Okay, second announcement. Second announcement from me. You cannot tell anybody outside this room. I'm serious, because you can't. You'll understand why. No, seriously. This is like I'm not supposed to do what I'm about to do. Okay, and it's totally unkosher in every way. I was asked for the second or third time by the Library of Congress to nominate people for the Poet Laureateship of the United States of America. I'm not supposed to say even that. They asked me for 3 names. I'm not supposed to say who the names are. The flowers are jumping out of the vase. I gave them 1 name. There is no way that they will choose this person for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the phrase official verse culture, poet laureateship, I don't think so. However, fuck the Library of Congress. They're never going to ask me again if they find out this, but what do you think? I nominated... Who do we write to? Oh, no, James, please don't. I've just blown any power I had at the Library of Congress, but I nominated, and will you agree, that this person would make a fantastic United States Poet Laureate, Charles Bernstein. So, Marjorie, who knows this game, just said, why did Al screw that up? Because now he's not out of the game, right? Oh, you didn't say that. Okay. All right. Okay. So, I'm going to ask Michael to say this is a 1-minute toast, and there'll be a few more, and then I will be ruthless in saying we should get to partying, okay? Michael, thank you. Stand.
I want to thank Al for organizing this too. I mean, it really has been a terrific evening. We've heard a lot about Charles at Buffalo and at Penn, but I would like to take some credit for bringing him to San Diego to teach for a quarter a long time ago, and we've been friends for a long time. Charles is, as he admits, pataqueroid, which makes some readers pataquizzical. Others find him anti-absorptive, multimodal, fractal, and unfashionable. In an interview with Charles, Henry James once advised, "Be someone upon whom nothing is lost." And this is his great talent: to repurpose what is most familiar and run it through the mill of refractory ambivalence. His mind is quick on the draw. He moves so swiftly that he seldom finishes a sentence. Notice how in his early poetry he begins a sentence and then, in his later work he completes sentences he never began. Sullen, supposition, salacious conjecture, slurpy, deduction. One should note his use of the unfashionable idiom of popular culture, slurpy, in the same sentence as the fashionable argot, deduction, which leaves readers bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. He was, as we know, one of the founders of language writing and one of its most articulate critics when that movement began to settle into an encyclopedia entry. And just as he was central to the evolution of language writing, so he broke down the center of language-centeredness to bring the body, wit, didacticism, classical epigrams, stand-up comedy, and elegiac sadness. His characteristic didactic tone, as manifest in Apoetics and other verse epistles, often mocks its own stentorian attitude, as if to say, unscrew the locks from the doors. No, actually, just find the key. He was a student of Stanley Cavell's at Harvard, whose book, Must We Mean What We Say, was influential to Charles' work, but who rewrote it as, must we be mean when we say meaning? And of course, Charles is not mean, as these commentaries have said tonight. He contains multitudes. He is the president of regulation. He lives in the expanded field of all kinds of stuff: bagels, laundry, taxis, hats. He looks good in hats. Air conditioning, riddles, Mao Zedong, epistemology, and its cousin, Krippistemology. He has been embarrassingly generous to others, present company included. His academic legacy, first at Buffalo and now at Penn, will live on through the diaspora of students he has mentored and who have gone on to become significant writers, critics, and scholars. And as a friend, he has been willing to put up with banal questions, to read articles of dubious worth, and respond to emails with the speed and dexterity of a gymnast. He likes a Manhattan, although he's been known to have a martini when in Midtown. He's the only person I know who wondered, quote, who would have thought Paul McCartney would be the Perry Como of the 1990s? As he rides off into the sunset toward Brooklyn, which is hard to do from Philadelphia, we salute a major poet, teacher, and dear friend.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to ask Susan Bernstein, then Tom Mandel, then David Wallace. Susan, come on up. I'm going to ask everybody to limit themselves to 1 minute in this section.
I'm going to try. I just have two things to say, and I have no notes. Charles and I are first cousins. Our fathers were brothers, and it's quite possible that I am the person in the room who has known him the longest. For sure. I remember going to Charles's bar mitzvah. And I'll say no more about that. But what I want to say, and Charles, you'll remember this story from 20-some years ago when I had the pleasure of introducing you when you gave a reading at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I was teaching. And I have this story from Charles's sister Leslie, that when Charles was maybe 10 or 11, his teacher called his parents with concern. how are things at home? Now, I just realized this might be a clue to why he was not allowed to continue at Ethical Culture. Anyhow, he'd written a poem, and this might be perhaps the earliest Charles Bernstein poem. And this was like 1960 maybe, and this is the poem, As I Have Been Told. The mud, trudging through the mud. I hate the mud. The mud. So, I don't know about Ethical Culture. The only other thing I wanted to say, and I think this is fitting because it is Charles's birthday, is I wanted to remember my aunt and his mother, Sherry. And I know many of you here have known Sherry over the years. If this party had happened a year earlier, or if she had lived a year later, she would have been here in the center, loving it. She was so proud of Charles. She loved his success and his fame, and she would have just been thrilled to be here. That's so for Sherry.
Thank you, Susan. By the way, we now have a recording of that poem, and it will go to his PennSound page, the earliest one. Clear as mud. Tom Mandel, David Wallace is up next, and then Jack Krick is after that. 1 minute, please.
I had no idea that I would get up and speak. In fact, I wasn't sure I'd be here. There's no praise to add to this outpouring of praise. You should all be proud of yourselves for being here, proud for knowing Charles, and all I will say is that I met Charles in, 78. And as he just reminded me, I gave him his first reading in California at the Poetry Center. It was a great reading. I remember Robert Duncan taking notes. I mean this. I remember Robert Duncan taking notes, and afterwards, if I'm right, giving a yellow-lined sheet of paper to Charles with his notes. I don't think they were intended to help, but they were definitely an homage, and to which I'm happy to share my voice. I think Charles Bernstein is one of the most remarkable people of our time, and I feel proud to know him and count him a friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. David Wallace is up next, then Jack Krick, and then Christian. 1 minute, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Wallace. I'm a medievalist in the English department. Thank you. Thank you. Charles gets medieval more than any other colleague I've ever known, amazingly. There's one particular trope, a medieval trope called occupatio, in which you say something while pretending not to say it. For example, I need not say that I was chair of the English department when we hired Charles Bernstein. The Middle Ages used to be seen as foundational, national, laying a kind of ground from which other things came, which is completely not right. It's a very 19th century construction. It is inchoate, full of beginnings, false beginnings, re-beginnings. It's migratory, it's experimental, and it's everything that Charles loves, I think. So he's always got that about us. And I've worked with Davy, Chris, and Orchid, have taken my courses. Orchid did a fantastic thing. We did the Book of Marjorie Kemp, 15th century Middle English, and she read it in her, is it South Island, New Zealand? Read it into a machine, and it came back as an amazing new text. An amazing new text. So since we've got this, I just want to end with my own taking advantage of this by reading a few words of Middle English and seeing what comes. In a summer season when soft was the sunny.
Don't, Misty, you don't have to.
No, try it. That's good. This is fun. This is great. Yeah. Yeah, no. En a sommarsäsong when softe was the sun. No. He shot me in Schrodis as he a ship wearer. He shot me in Schrodis as he a ship wearer. Verwacht and verwonderd, wonders de Herren. Thank you.
Everybody's so good. Even the 1 minute people are so fantastic. Jack, Krick, and then... I was being funny, Tom. Jack, Krick, and then Christian. Jack, come on up.
Hey, lots of people have testified to Charles's generosity, and I'm another one that's going to do that too. Charles let me begin making web pages on the Electronic Poetry Center 15 years ago, back in 2004. That indirectly led me to teaching at Temple in 2011 because I was having lunch with Rachel Blau du Plessis one day in 2010, and I wound up getting hired to teach technical writing at Temple. I wasn't a career academic. I used to be a technician and a computer industry trade press journalist and then a technical writer for the last 20 years. And what was the last thing? Oh, yeah. Ron Silliman and Bob Perelman, both of whom I know because of Charles, and I published a book of the poetry of David Bromwich last year. And all of those things happened because I knew this guy over here. Okay, I want to tell a story that everybody in the Philadelphia poetry community has heard numerous times, and I'm kind of embarrassed to do this because I do an imitation of Charles, and I don't think he's heard this before, but perhaps I'm wrong. But the first time I met Charles in real life, I went to a reading of his in 1988 at Temple, and the reading is on PennSound because they recorded it on a cassette. And at the reception afterwards, Charles came over to me and he said, you know, I didn't see you in any of the classes here today. Are you at the university? And I said, no, I'm this guy that drives around in a truck and repairs computers. And he turned around to his faculty sponsor. Was that Doug Meserly? I'm not sure. Okay, well, in any case, 1988. So he turns around to whoever it was and says, you see, this is exactly what I was telling you this afternoon. There are these people out there, they're driving around in trucks, repairing computers, and they're reading poetry. Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. Second to last but not least, Christian Buck, who also still has the award. I think it's about as far as you could possibly get. Came all the way from Australia, Christian Buck.
Thank you, one and all, for coming out tonight. I have only 2 footnotes to add to all of your great contributions to this evening. I would like to thank Charles, primarily because I have been very fortunate in my life to have many mentors, and he is among the few that did not become one of my tormentors. I'd also like to quote my favorite thing that Charles has ever said. I think that this is extraordinarily sagacious in its insight. A blank sheet of paper with a poem written on it is worth less than a blank sheet of paper. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I said second to last. I said second to last. Truly last. Charles Bernstein.
So that line, which I like very much, is actually by James Sherry, who's right here in the front row. The political, the economy of poetry, and James published my first works, and so many people that I know from the 70s and onward who've been so generous to me. So this is obviously an extraordinary thing to listen to, and I'm very grateful to the people who spoke. I want to particularly again to say how much I'm grateful to Susan B. It's because of her great insight and her many editorial skills, including in almost all my early essays, writing in the side, "This makes no sense!" exclamation point. Circled, and this was an enormous help to me, because actually I still don't know the difference. So it's good to get some external feedback, and also, of course, to Felix, who's here, and it's been such a wonderful person, and also to Emma, who's mentioned once, who's so fundamental to my life. So there's my life as a poet and essayist, but so much here at Penn and Buffalo has to do with my teaching, especially teaching as an undergraduate teacher and as in the PhD program. And Susan Howe, spoke to that. I mean, it was so amazing for both of us in 1988, 89 to sort of come out of the blue. Susan and I often remark about the fact that we didn't even know there was a category of first generation to go to college. It would have helped me when I went to college to have known, because I was so disoriented at college and so hostile, really, although wonderful teachers like Stanley Cavell, Rogers Albritton, especially when I was in college, who I was fortunate to meet. So I was completely just anything beyond those 4 years of college is impossible to imagine. Then all of a sudden I was, as Susan Howe, we were made full professors, and of course we're very grateful to Robert Creeley, among many other people at Buffalo, and so I'm so happy to have my dear friend and who I love so much, Will Creeley, who is here, thinking of Penn too. Bob was incredible for us to welcome us to Buffalo and to continue what was going on there with the Poetics program, which was the idea that poets and literary artists had something to contribute to scholarship and to teaching literature, not creative writing. I have nothing against teaching creative writing, but I think that it's important to have people who are literary artists or artists, poets, teaching in PhD programs. Bob was himself an example of that, Dennis Hedlock, Raymond Fetterman. And then it just was so amazing to me, the people I've got to collaborate with. I've collaborated with many people outside of Buffalo, some of whom are here and spoke about that, and especially, I would say here, Al Filreis, because here at Penn, I mean, to have work with Al and also Jessica Lowenthal, both of whom are organized this event, has been an unbelievable experience. I can't express how much it's made possible what I've done here, and with not just PennSound, but the Kelly Writers House and the context that we have. So of course, Al, how much I've loved that. But I want to, yeah. So I mean, Al. I always use the word genius to describe Al Filreis. Nobody I've met in my life in respect to poetry who's been able to deal with institutions and create the kind of resources that Al has done with Mod Po and PennSound and the Kelly Writers House. It's just there's nothing even to compare it with in my experience. So I certainly want to say that in terms of Penn, and also want to say in terms of Penn too. I say this in one of my interviews. It's just amazing that my colleagues and the people at Penn have put up with me for 15 years. I mean, I'm a kind of odd person to be there, and they've always been just unfailingly generous and supportive. And so, I mean, Jed, the chair, and is here. And the English department has been a fantastic place to be, and I'm so happy. And I think I could speak for Bob Perelman too, because the two of us were like brothers here, and it was so great to work with Bob. I won't mention many of my other colleagues because there'd be too many names, but certainly Bob and Susan Stewart when I arrived, the three of us, that was just, such a great experience. And so I want to say, because it's still her first year here, how great it is that Simone White is now a professor here at Penn, and how lucky we are, there she is, how lucky we are at Penn, that Simone has joined this company. But what I want to talk about is the students that I've worked with, undergraduates and graduates. So it's 30 years. I directed 50 dissertations, never having written one. I wrote some books. And I was on 25 other committees, so I worked with 75 different graduate students. And in every case, it was to my benefit. I learned so much in collaboration with those people working. And my attitude as somebody working with graduate students is, how can I help you? What can I learn from you? What can I do to make what you're doing easier and better? And also even here, people always thank me for things that I said, well, I'm actually paid for that, writing my letters of recommendation. And it's what my job is, to support the students. But I've been so lucky. I mean, and you had some of the earlier graduate students who were at Buffalo when I arrived. I'm looking at Elizabeth Willis, who was actually the person at Buffalo for the longest before I arrived, and I think she stayed around for an extra 5 years once I did arrive, and so amazing. And Peter Gizzi, Juliana Spar was mentioned. There are so many others from that period onward. But I mean, for me, the question in teaching has to do with listening, and the ability to listen to what all of these different people I have worked with have said has been just so powerful for me. It's enabled me to be who I am. Everything I am is because of the people I've collaborated with who are here and the students I have worked with. And I sometimes, I can't say that enough, how the possibility of what I do has to do with, as was said, the conversation with all of you. So thank you so very much. Thank you.
Charles Bernstein. Charles Bernstein. There he is, Charles Bernstein. So, you're all standing.
Gave me my first job.
We have barbecue, meat, vegan, we have cake, we have whiskey, we have beer, we have time. We have a studio. Please stay and party and congratulate Charles. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Stay and party.